Hello there, everybody. Welcome. I am Jonathan Michel, the Manager of Scientific Services at the Aurora Research Institute. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is our first attempt at something like this. I would like to introduce you to our speaker today. Her name is Christy Benson. She has worked in the North for about 15 years with the Gwich'in Department of Cultural Heritage. She is an archaeologist and anthropologist by trade, as well as an adult educator and professional writer. She has been an editor for ARI's annual compendium publication for the past 3 years. Christy has developed her skills in communication, and in particular, she is talented at translating technical language into plain language. So without further ado, I welcome you to Christy Benson.
Thank you, Jonathan. How's my sound? Is it okay? Can you just let me know if my sound's okay?
I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for attending this webinar. We're going to be talking about writing in plain language. We'll focus on the task of you writing about your research for Northern audiences for your submission to the ARI's compendium, but you'll hopefully get some skills and insight that will be helpful for writing for any audience, including your academic peers. So plain language writing skills will also help your poster preparation and community newsletters too. So a bit of housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded so that it can be made available on the ARI's website. The presentation today will be about an hour, and I'll be accepting questions at the end of this session. So if you have a question, feel free to just type it into the chat box, but keep in mind that I'll be getting to them at the end. So if I miss your question as it goes by, just ask it again in the chat when we're done. And if you have a question but you don't want your name included in the recording, you can just provide your contact information and ask the question offline. Okay, so what is plain language? It's communication that your audience can understand the first time they read it. So written material is considered to be in plain language if your audience can, number one, find what they need, number two, understand what they find, and number three, use what they find to meet their needs. Okay, so no one technique defines plain language. It's not about the number of short words or anything specific or algorithmic. It's defined by results. It's easy to read, understand, and use. Now, the US government has a great plain language website. You can see the link at the bottom. There's a fantastic PDF guide that you can download. Now, it's focused on the type of writing that are typically covered by the US plain language laws, like warning labels on generators, but don't let that stop you. It's fascinating and useful. So for the rest of this webinar, we'll be looking more at these two things, okay? That final point, which is about writing content that actually meets your audience's needs, that's a bigger topic, and that's kind of why you're doing research in the first place, so I'm going to leave that one on your shoulders. Okay, so you sit down. You have to write a fill in the blank, an article, a thesis, what have you. Again, we'll use the compendium as our baseline, but this applies across the board. So first up, you need to define your audience. Now, I write for a few different audiences, so I find it useful to actually jot down some bullet points at the top of a new document. Who am I writing for? If I'm writing for my peers, I know I can get away with a bit more in the way of technical jargon, although we'll touch on the danger of that later. If I'm writing for the public, then who's the specific audience of the public? Is it interested amateurs, young people, parents, and so on? For the compendium, your audience is already nicely defined, Northerners, and those with about a grade 6 level of reading comprehension. Okay, and you also want to grab attention. So just sort of keep this in mind for now. Park it in the back of your brain. For the compendium, you don't have much space to spend on this, maybe just a quick sentence. But for your other writing, you do need to get your audience's attention. You need to pique their curiosity. You need to give them a reason to keep reading. Your audience, after all, is human. They have a human attention spans. And in fact, we'll come back to your audience again and again and again, since your audience is the whole point of writing in plain language. So your audience needs to be able to find what they need, because much of the time people read to get answers or to get information they need or want. They want to know what's happening, they want answers to their questions, and they want to gain this knowledge quickly. So your writing should respond to their needs. To assist people in finding what they need in your writing, you can make use of headings. Okay, obviously you won't be using headings in the compendium, but for other writing, headings are vitally important. So we'll talk about them a bit. Okay, you're going to be making sure that your writing is in logical order. And logical order matters in sentences, in paragraphs, in chapters, and in manuscripts. We're going to talk about document length, but here's the big reveal. Generally, keeping things shorter is better. And then easy to read design features. If you have the ability to add design features, like if you're preparing a poster or newsletter article, then making it easier on the eye is helpful. Okay, so there are a few useful types of headings. The first one is the question heading. So what is white nose syndrome in bats? And the second kind is a statement heading. Bats are dying from white nose syndrome. Those are both useful headings that will give your readers a good idea of what the content is below. So less useful is a heading that's just a sort of a fragment, like white nose syndrome. Now, certainly I know that the paragraph is going to be about white nose syndrome, but you can see that the previous two types of headings are going to give me a much better idea as a reader. Okay, so here's some examples of statement headings that are pretty useful. So we have the emergence of a novel fungal pathogen, and then we have pathology of G. destructans infection in the wings of hibernating bats. Now, it took me looking through about 10 articles on white nose syndrome before I found these headings, by the way. Okay, so another example of a good heading. So this section is usually just called discussion, but here we have discussion. Criteria for discriminating between fluvial, aeolian, and shallow marine depositional environments in Precambrian sedimentary rocks. This heading told me exactly what I'd find here, and it made me curious to keep reading. It invited me to read. Another way to help the reader find what they need is to organize the information logically. And not logically for you, dear author, logically for your reader. Okay, you already know a lot about depositional environments and might find turbidity to be the best way to organize your thoughts. But who's your audience? Can they make that leap? Or you might find it easiest to organize your thoughts about white nose syndrome in bats based on the last name of the scientist who first described the disease in various populations. And this is very common. But your readers will thank you for using categories that they find natural, like species or region. So here's some general tips that can apply across the board about logically organizing your writing. So you can start with general information and then get more specific and add in exceptions afterwards. In rare circumstances, you can mix things up here as a rhetorical device or if you need to change opinions. But usually, this setup makes the most sense. So something like, bats are mammals, and like all mammals, are subject to certain diseases. Most of the time, they can mount an immune defense, and/or evolutionary mechanisms will protect the population. White nose syndrome is a new disease in bats. For reasons XYZ, it's decimating bat populations. Bats on islands are a rare exception. So that was a very logical flow. Okay, so here's one that I just scrambled together that's less so. Bats on an island in the Pacific don't seem to be getting white nose syndrome, which is overwhelming bats' ability to bounce back from diseases like they normally would. It's a new disease that just arrived from Europe a while ago. Bats are small flying mammals with immune systems. Okay, so obviously that was exaggerated for effect, but not much. You'll also want to ensure the flow is logical. Don't split up stuff that makes sense together. Feel free to move paragraphs, sections, and sentences around once you've finished writing them. So just because you thought of something in a particular order and typed it up doesn't mean that that's a logical order. So it's very handy to take a step back and go, okay, here's my writing, here's my 5 pages of writing. You know, is there an actual logical flow to this? Now, once you've checked your writing for logical flow and you've got your sentences and organized nicely in your paragraphs and your paragraphs organized nicely in your document, Go back and just see if it makes sense to stick in a topic sentence in the paragraph at the start. So this helps skimmers, who's lots of people, find what they need. And it also means that readers won't get to the end where a writer naturally puts the conclusion, and then have to read the paragraph again. So if you think back to those first few slides, we want to prevent people from having to read stuff again. Okay, and go ahead and use lists, tables, and bullet points with, abandon where they make sense. But don't forget to introduce them to give your reader an idea of, what's coming. So keep the document text as short as you reasonably can and make use of design elements that will catch your audience's eye. Okay, so here's an example of an award-winning poster that I found online. Note the short paragraphs here, plus the use of arrows, interesting and well-produced graphs, colored circles with large text, and careful use of different fonts. Now here's another example. This poster has columns of text. So imagine you're at a poster session, coffee in hand, wandering around, you have 5 minutes. Which poster would draw you in? Which one would you read? So even if you read both, the attractive first one will probably take less energy for you to read and understand, so making it easier for you to remember. And in scenarios like a poster session where people can and will choose interesting, well-presented information, you're doing your topic a service by presenting it well. It's cool enough and important enough to have been funded and to nab your attention as a researcher. So share it well. It feels like we're doing a topic a disservice by not including every single tiny detail, doesn't it? It feels like that. But we have to fight against that urge. If we stuff every detail into our writing at the expense of brevity and style, we lose our audience. So it's a shooting ourselves in the foot scenario. Okay, so we're getting a better idea of how to help our audience find what they need, with headings, logical organization, and by keeping the document brief and looking good. So next up, our audiences need to understand what they find easily. And we can help them do this by using you and other pronouns, by writing in the active voice, by using short sentences and short sections, and by using common everyday words. Okay, don't do backflips to avoid using pronouns. Use pronouns. We, I, you, etc. Use proper names if it makes sense too. Using pronouns gives a much clearer picture of who did what and why. And yes, even in academic publications. Note that for the compendium, there is a requirement for third person. So you can just get it out of your system when you're writing for the compendium. Just get that third person writing right out of your system. Okay, so here are some examples. This is neuroscientist and linguist Steven Pinker and co-author Paul Bloom writing about language acquisition. And you can see the highlighted section. We see a reason why functionalist theories of evolution, and so on. So they're talking about themselves using a pronoun. Very clear. Now here's from another publication with some pronoun avoiding text highlighted. I was pleasantly surprised to have to search quite a few papers about language acquisition to find this, and even this paper had some pronoun use in a few paragraphs. But maybe that's because linguists have a better idea about how to get their points across than we do. Okay, so here we see the top snippet has the authors further explain, which pulls me out of the text, and I go, which authors? Okay, the authors of this exact paper? Or is it the authors that he was just speaking about above, that big string of different papers from 2015 and 2017? I'm not even going to try to pronounce their names. Okay, and then the second one. So this positive emotion in L2 WTC research, a methodological gap also can be noted. So having no actor in this sentence makes it less understandable, and it's worded a little bit awkwardly, but this could have easily said, we also noted, okay? And just as a little tangent, I made a relatively big effort to remember what WTC means, because I thought, if someone asks in the webinar, I want to make sure I remember what it means, but I don't remember what it means. And we'll get a little bit into acronyms in a few slides. Okay, so active voice. So this topic is closely related to the last slide, wherein the use of personal pronouns was discussed. Okay, wait, that actually is not that easy to understand, okay? Where I discussed using personal pronouns, okay? So the first sentence was an example of passive construction, and the second, the one that's showing now, is active. In the first, the subject of the sentence, the use of personal pronouns, was acted upon by the verb, who was discussed. We don't know who. Who did that, you know? And it was me. I discussed the pronouns. So typically, this way, where I discussed using personal pronouns, is it's easier for your readers to understand. The active voice keeps sentences kind of neat and tidy. And furthermore, it's generally good to try and keep the who, the did, and the what close together in your sentences. So a sentence like, a 10-pound sample bag of sandy soils, which were dampened slightly before being collected through excavation using a trowel, was filled. So that is a little bit hard to parse. As I read that out, it's hard to parse. It's hard for me to, I have to keep all of this information in my head. There was a sample bag, there was sandy soils, they were dampened. What the heck is going on? Before I get to the end, okay. We filled that sample bag. That's what's going on, okay? So I could, instead of that awkward phrase, I could say, we collected a soil sample. This sample was, and so on. So I'd like to point out that we can't avoid all instances of the passive voice, nor would we want to, okay? It has a time and place. When it's the most clear way of getting the point across, then use it. Okay, so here's some examples. We found feldspar inclusions. And the second one, feldspar inclusions were found. So the first example is active. The second example is passive. But the second one is fine if you don't know, or you don't care if your audience knows who found the feldspar, okay? Now, all that said, the passive construction is massively overused, especially in academic writing, and often to avoid those scary pronouns. Okay, so here's an example from one of the same papers as the last slide. So we have, moreover, enjoyment was found as an important factor in increasing WTC. This could have been rewritten as, we found that enjoyment is, and it would have been much more easy to read, easy to parse. It wouldn't have, this actually made me stutter as I read it. I was like, enjoyment was found? By whom? So I do recommend that you go back over your writing after it's done. Again, repeating theme, go back over your writing after you've finished writing it. And just check out every time you use that passive construction and say, hey, would this be more clear if it was switched up to be an active construction? And generally, it will be. Okay, so when you're writing for public audiences, it's generally better to keep sentences short. So if you glance back over what you've written and see a sentence with a lot of parentheses, commas, subplots, and extras, break it up. You don't want to make your audience work. If they have to hold the beginning and the middle of a long sentence in their memories as they wade through to the later part, they might give up, or they might have to reread, and we don't want that. We want them to read, understand, and remember the first time. Okay, so it's also a good plan to keep your paragraphs and sections short too. Many readers find long paragraphs are just a turnoff, so keep them short. One easy way to do this is to keep each paragraph to a single topic. So as you're giving your writing that good once or twice or thrice over, looking for logical flow, moving sentences and paragraphs around, finding passives, all that stuff, just keep an eye out. Is this paragraph about a single idea? Yeah, so here's an article I found on the Smithsonian website about eggshells. There's some really good stuff here. So the first paragraph grabs our attention. I mean, okay, I want to read on. And then check out how short each paragraph is after that. There's no giant gray columns of justified text. So humans have a tendency to speak sort of highfalutin, okay? But I would urge you to use common everyday words a bit more often. So use the simplest form of a verb and use strong forms of verbs when they fit. Don't be afraid to be bold or to state things baldly. Avoid sticking in extra verbs or extra words around verbs that don't actually add anything. This is very tempting for us humans for some reason. Okay, so some sort of random examples from the compendium would be, we were successful in conducting several days of electrofishing. How about we conducted? Or we are in the process of synthesizing data versus we are synthesizing. Okay, so here's one I saw as I was preparing this presentation. Now it's a bullet point, so it's not a full sentence, which is fine, but we can see here there's the electrical transmission infrastructure is facilitating the transmission of electricity. Wouldn't just transmit be better and more accurate? Are the transmission lines really just facilitating? Which sort of implies to me that the power would somehow get there even without the lines. Okay. Next up, avoid noun strings and other similar constructions. So these are strings of words which all modify or describe the final noun in the string. So for example, a low noise issue calibrated submersible acoustic data logging hydrophone was used. Wow, it just causes brain drain and it causes attention to drift. The reader doesn't know what you're speaking about until they get to the very end. So they have to hold all of these ideas in their head until, oh, phew, they get to what you're really talking about, a hydrophone. Okay, and I don't know what a hydrophone even is, but we'll get to that later. And did you catch that the sentence is passive? It ends with was used. So how about we used a hydrophone, which is a sensitive instrument placed under the surface of the water, which, and so on. So more than 3 of these modifying nouns in a row means that readability plummets. So here's another example. Predicted ambient total suspended particulate concentration. So these are often used when we're, as authors, we're trying to cut down on the number of words. So we use this construction because it's fewer words to get the same point across. So beware of this habit, in particular for the compendium. You can generally just nix these for the compendium, by the way, by chopping out a bunch of those words. Okay, it's important to you as a researcher, to us as researchers, that the hydrophone is each and every one of these 20 things. But does our audience actually need to know that in this context? Does our audience, for the compendium, need to know that? Go ahead and use contractions how you would in speech. This doesn't mean that you can't use all of this, by the way, doesn't mean that you can't use accurate and technical words where it's important to do so. And it doesn't mean that you can't use beautiful words either. It just means that you'll be careful and thoughtful. You'll be selective. So if you feel the need to define a word or phrase in your text, just ask yourself if another word or common phrase would work instead. Definitions are double tough for our audiences, okay? They're new words or new phrases to learn, and they take the reader out of the narrative. So here's an example. We collected natural environmental archives with a little definition of lake sediment and peat cores, or an example, I guess. So this could just be we collected lake sediment cores and peat cores. So similarly, don't categorize if you don't need to. Now, does the reader of the compendium really need to know that sediment cores and peat cores fit nicely together into a whole new category called natural environmental archives? Maybe they do need to know that, depending on what we're writing about. But in this case, the author was talking about stuff that had happened in the past. So this lumping wasn't necessary, and it asked the audience to do work. So a couple of final tips. Use the same word for the same concept throughout, especially if it's a slightly hard to grasp topic. Your audience is much more comfortable with repetition than you expect. I repeat, your audience is much more comfortable with repetition than you expect. And don't abbreviate. Use nicknames or the full name instead, even if it's going to be repeated a few times. Think back to just a couple seconds ago when I was talking about repetition, okay? Our audiences are generally okay with repetition. So here's an example from a research summary. We had Fisheries Act authorization, and then here, here reader, memorize this new acronym, FAA. So this author then went on to use this acronym once. So they saved themselves 2 words, but they asked their readers to learn a whole new acronym, a whole new thing, chunked into their memory. Okay? In this case, just using Fisheries Act authorization would have been perfectly fine. But if you're saying something over and over and over, you can assign it a nickname. So a nickname for this could be something like the authorization. Instead of the Fisheries Act authorization, it could be just the authorization. So much of the advice about plain language writing is just a reframe of beware of the curse of knowledge. So the curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias. It's a cognitive bias which leads people to think that other people around them have the same ability to understand stuff, okay? The same experiences, the same education, that everyone is on sort of the same comprehension plane, okay? Oh, wait, not everybody knows what a cognitive bias is, do they? So when I used that phrase like that, I was suffering from the curse of knowledge. When I said that, I was assuming unconsciously that everyone in this audience is as fascinated by cognitive biases as I am, and has read about them and thought about them. But that's not the case. That's almost certainly not the case. A cognitive bias is a brain shortcut. Okay, there are hundreds, and trust me when I say they are fascinating and important, especially if you're an educator. They're shortcuts that our brains take in specific contexts when longer, harder thinking is usually not required. When a thinking shortcut is usually just fine, saves glucose. So there's a big list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia, and I highly recommend you pull them out next time you're socializing with other researchers in your field, and just to see how many you've fallen prey to. So the curse of knowledge is this brain shortcut that goes something like this. I know what this means, so everyone must know what this means. Okay? Because, for the vast majority of the time through our evolutionary history, we could assume that everyone in our small family group really did have the same history, experience, and knowledge, as we ran across the savannah. But things have changed. My mechanic can't help himself when he talks about cold cranking amps, which is meaningless to me. And my music teacher talks about major and minor chords, and I don't even know how to hold the instrument. I'm still trying to play Mary Had a Little Lamb. So the curse of knowledge is remarkably pervasive among all people with normal functioning brains. And scientists are certainly people. So the truth is that we vastly overestimate how much other people understand, even our academic peers. So it can feel patronizing to use simple words, simple constructions, and to spell things out. But it's good practice to resist the temptation to write using technical jargon so you don't come across as patronizing. And here's why. You're much less likely to be patronizing than you are to be misunderstood or unclear, again, even with your academic peers. Now, unfortunately, just knowing that cognitive biases exist and that we'll likely fall prey to them doesn't make us any less biased. So saying, oh, okay, curse of knowledge is a thing, got it, it won't make your writing any less cursed, unfortunately. So try to exercise knowledge-cursed writing by doing a few extra things. Have someone else from your intended audience, if possible, or just someone else, read your writing and give you some feedback about, this didn't make sense. This made me hop out of the narrative. Okay. You can also just put it away for a few days or a few weeks. Just close the file and come back and read it again with fresh eyes. This can be very illuminating. Okay. And then finally, read it out loud. This doesn't do much for the curse of knowledge stuff, but it can really help make sure that sentences flow nicely. Okay, to finish up, we're going to review some good examples of research summaries from this year's compendium. Okay, so the climate of the Inuvik region is changing rapidly and will continue to change in the coming decades as a result of human-released greenhouse gases. I mean, that grabs my attention. For example, so here we see an example Examples are wonderful ways to explain a point without using a definition. And in this case, a couple of examples is even better than the one example. Multiple examples can allow the reader to triangulate in on your meaning. Since Inuvik was formed in the late 1950s, the number of winter days below -40°C has decreased. Over the last few years, there have been very few days with such low temperatures. In the summer, the number of days over 20°C have increased dramatically. In addition, the amount of rain in the summer and snow in the winter has also been gradually changing. The result is that more shrubs are growing on the tundra north of Inuvik. The permafrost is thawing, and lake and river levels are changing. There are also examples of lakes rapidly draining due to thawing permafrost. Everyone is wondering, how's this for inviting? How will the snow, the lakes, and the rivers change in the coming decades? And what will they be like 50 years from now? In order to answer these questions, the research team is carrying out studies of the snow, lakes, and rivers. So the studies of the snow, lakes, and rivers, notice the use of everyday words without losing meaning, okay? So the author didn't say the research team is carrying out biogeohydrological investigations or what have you. The water at this site has been observed since the 1970s. In 2016, there were researchers and students from around Canada and the world studying the water at this site. This research used many types of new equipment. Here we are, many types of new equipment. Naria Biogeohydrophone site. And yes, you absolutely need to include the make and model of the equipment that you're using in an academic publication, which will allow for replication and all that good scientific methody stuff. But your compendium audience doesn't need it, and they don't want it. It doesn't make a research summary better. So if no one can understand it's missing its point. Now, if this project was testing out a new type of equipment, which certainly happens sometimes, the entire project is about testing a new piece of equipment in the north, then yeah, as an audience, we want you to talk about it. We want to know what it is. But if it's secondary, so we as researchers find it cool and fun to talk about the equipment. We want to shout out about it. But we do ourselves a service by thinking about what our audience needs. Okay? Including drones to map the snow and vegetation and to measure snow, soil moisture, and runoff. The snow cover at the end of winter was amongst the lowest on record. The research team will use the information they gathered to try and figure out what the waters in this area will be like in the future. Okay, a great example. So our second example is a social science one, and very clearly written as well. The focus of the research was on connections between land, language, and wellness. The two researchers interviewed 10 Gwich'in elders from Inuvik, Aklavik, Fort McPherson, and Siehachik in late June and early July 2016. 7 women elders and 3 male elders shared their experiences growing up on the land and their views on the importance of knowing the land, traditional foods and medicines, knowing the language, and being well. So being well, not enhancing holistic wellness. So these elders were also asked what advice they had for the youth. So what advice they had for the youth instead of transgenerational knowledge transfer. And I will put my soul out here. I have used the phrase transgenerational knowledge transfer. I have fallen down and used that phrase, so I'm guilty here. But this is obviously more clear. And how they thought the youth should be taught about the land, language, and ways to be healthy. The interviews were video recorded with the permission of all participants. The researchers are still typing out the interviews, not transcribing, which everybody doesn't know what transcribing means. Typing out the interviews and editing the videos so they can be returned to the participants. The Gwich'in Tribal Council Department of Cultural Heritage provided guidance for the project and will receive copies of all the video and written interview material as soon as they are ready. The researchers gave an oral presentation to go on to finish up about the project. And so another really great example of a compendium entry here. Okay, so our final example The purpose of this project is to understand how rocks on Banks Island, and I mean, how great is this? Okay, rocks on Banks Island, not Cenozoic paleogeography. And I don't actually know if this is about Cenozoic paleogeography. I just picked a confusing term. Okay, so they're not saying the purpose of this project is Cenozoic paleogeography on Banks Island. It's about Cenozoic paleogeography. So Cenozoic paleogeography is a concept in the author's mind that stands in for rocks very easily for him because he's just so knowledgeable about it, right? He's so deeply knowledgeable about this that the concept, which is a hazy thing in his mind, very clearly, he knows when he says, this phrase, Cenozoic paleogeography, that he's actually talking about these rocks and the information gleaned from these rocks. Okay, but avoiding knowledge cursed writing often means speaking very concretely. So getting taking a step back from these concepts and getting right down to the concrete items and things that we can touch and talk about. So rocks on Banks Island and in the Beaufort Sea, how they formed and changed over hundreds of millions of years, not 1.86642 million years, hundreds of millions of years. A nice, easy to understand phrase. This project is also checking to see if there might be diamonds on Banks Island. I will admit this is pretty attention grabbing. Ooh, diamonds? Geological fieldwork was conducted on Banks Island between June 30th and July 22nd in the second and final year of the project. The research team worked for 5 days at Nelson Head and 2.5 weeks at Polar Bear Cabin on northern Banks Island. Each day, field parties of between 2 and 6 people were flown by helicopter to study and collect samples of rocks. These rocks were taken back to the Calgary office and then sent out to labs where they will be analyzed, not processed for analysis, to determine how old they are. There's not a single mention here of lead strontium isotopes, okay? Which is, this is much clearer. How old are they? The purpose of any kind of isotopic dating test is to see how old something is, and to see the climatic conditions when they formed, and where they formed. For example, the deep sea, a shallow shelf, or in rivers. And I just like, there's so much good about this, but a deep sea, there's nothing like pelagic or profundal. The team also looked for evidence that the bedrock had cracked and folded on top of itself, which I know I'm sort of beating a dead horse here, but cracked and folded upon itself is such a clear way of talking about what the layers of the earth are doing when we're talking about deformation. The research team continued to collect samples from streams in the land to test for the presence of minerals associated with the type of rock, kimberlite, that could contain diamonds. Some of the planned work was canceled because of mechanical issues with the helicopter that prevented the team from flying. And this was a successful summer and project. Samples collected over the last 2 years continue to be analyzed, and reports will be issued as results continue to come in. So there's a little bit of extra continued in that final sentence, but most of all, a very easy, it's like a breath of fresh air reading this research summary. All right, so I apparently talked much more quickly than I had anticipated because we still have quite a bit of time. But I'd like to sort of make some recommended reading. So if you're interested in becoming a better author and taking your audience's needs into account and just becoming, having a lot better idea of how to craft words on the page, I recommend Steven Pinker's The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. I mean, there's some grammar stuff in there that can be a little bit hard to wade through, but the majority of the book is just so good and so fascinating, and he takes you right into the brain, to show how reading through difficult, poorly worded stuff is hard on us. He takes you right into why it's hard for our brains to get through this. Okay, and also Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which is about his lifetime of work with Tversky, which is they shared a Nobel Prize, I think, about cognitive biases. So also a very interesting book, especially if you're curious about why your brain does what it does, and why your audience's brains do these weird things. And then again, the Federal Plain Language Guidelines from the United States is chock full. Every single page has 5 or 6 things that are just so useful for our writing, and I couldn't stuff them all in this presentation, unfortunately, because we only had it 40 minutes. So if there's any, I didn't see any questions go by, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to either direct you to a good source or answer them if I happen to know. And otherwise, thank you so much for attending.